Hello all, and welcome to the March Patch Tuesday webcast. We will begin in just a few short moments, but before we do, I'd like to remind all attendees that they're currently in listen-only mode. But please feel free to ask questions of our panelists at any time, and we will answer them during the live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Heidi. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another March Patch Tuesday. We're almost 12 months in around since we first started in June last year. It's been a really amazing year, and these webcasts have helped us to develop the kind of content we're delivering to you via these mediums. And as usual, I've invited some experts from my team to help me today, one of which is John Cassell. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Everybody, my name is John Cassell, Senior Solutions Architect with Syxsense, based in sunny Southern California. Been in IT for many years, specializing in desktop, server operations, and at Syxsense, I dabble in pre-sales, customer onboarding, and training.
Thank you, John. And once again, my name is Rob Brown, Head of Customer Success from our UK head office. One of the departments is Patch Management Managed Services, and over the last 15 years, we've deployed over 100 million patches. So I want to cover off some feedback. We've had some brilliant feedback over the last 3 or 4 months, and a lot of this feedback has been around the length of these webcasts. And as we announced last month, we're going to try to restrict these to about 50 to 55 minutes. We know your time is very precious. Now, every single webcast is recorded and will be sent to you following its conclusion. You don't have to join live, so we will send everybody that subscribes to it a copy. We have a lot of questions on vulnerabilities. Now, last month we mentioned about vulnerabilities that are not patch related. So you have a vulnerability where you can deploy a patch, and you have a vulnerability where you need to reconfigure Windows or configure third-party applications to resolve that vulnerability. And often that is quite complex if you're working with PowerShell. We have, over the last 3 or 4 months, been developing a vulnerability solution database, which we're actually going to launch today. That's a really exciting value we're trying to bring, even if you're not a Syxsense client. And also lots of questions on reboot behaviors, and especially now as there are many users at home working remotely, how to get the best success out of your patching strategy if you are not able to enforce reboots. And so we're going to touch that in the next webinar about a strategy on how to ensure the success of patch management with both pre and post reboot requirements. Okay, so we'll cover off some news, and this will be the last month for Legacy Edge. So if you're familiar with Edge, it is a Windows feature, and it will become obsolete from April onwards. You've had the last update for it in yesterday's Patch Tuesday. So it's really important that you uninstall that feature and go forward with the application based, so that you can get patches for that browser. We also had a Google Chrome weaponized vulnerability in its stable channel 89.0.4389. That's really important, because it was actually weaponized this week and last week, which actually means that prior to this Patch Tuesday, you had a lot of work to do. And this has been causing some issues. There were 2 recalls last week and the week before. These are servicing stack updates that when they were released after patching, it would get to about 25 to 30% of the install and then just literally stop working. The 2 KBs were 5001078 and 79, and they replaced 601, 392, and 390. It's really important that if you have a patching strategy where you're deploying groups of patches together, because servicing stack updates are necessary for the install of patching. We're going to have a slide in a second to cover that. that you make sure that those two are not in your deployment, that you replace it with the very latest ones. We also heard, I think you pronounced that Excellion. There was an FTA breach. Now, Excellion is a piece of software for secured shared folders and data remotely around the world. It seems to be getting worse and worse, a bit like the solar winds. We've heard some rather large businesses, so Bombardier and Qualys, have actually had some breaches where data was stolen. It's really important that you have a strategy for third parties, third-party software. Don't just rely on Microsoft to bring your vulnerabilities via a patch management. You do need to make sure that you're patching your third parties as well. Lastly, I know John has a lot of new information on the Exchange weaponized attacks that we've experienced for the last week. Actually, so much so that the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency issued an emergency directive 2102 as a seriousness of this vulnerability. So I'm sure John will give us some fantastic feedback on that. So John, would you like to take us through what third parties and other material you've been working on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rob. I just want to always cover this every time, of course. Third-party updates are just as important as operating system updates to remedy potential vulnerabilities. Since last month, multiple updates have been released to resolve various issues. First, and most recently, Adobe released updates for various products since last month's webinar. Specifically, there were critical flaws detected in Adobe Connect, Creative Cloud, and FrameMaker, all affecting Windows installations. Multiple critical and important severity bugs resolved in Adobe Connect specifically. One critical flaw was related to improper input validation, which could allow for arbitrary code execution, as well as 3 important cross-scripting flaws, which could also allow for arbitrary JavaScript execution in the victim's browser if exploited. Adobe Connect version 11.0.5 and earlier are affected. There are also 3 critical vulnerabilities in the desktop version of Adobe Creative Cloud for Windows users. 2 of these flaws could enable arbitrary code execution. And the third stems from improper input validation and could allow an attacker to gain escalated privileges. Versions 5.3 and earlier of Creative Cloud are affected. In FrameMaker, Adobe fixed a critical vulnerability which could allow for arbitrary code execution if exploited. Again, sorry for the redundancy. This vulnerability is an out-of-bounds read error where the software reads data past the end of the intended buffer. An attacker who can read out-of-bounds memory could potentially gain sensitive values and in turn allowing code execution or denial of service. FrameMaker version 2019.0.8 and below for Windows are affected. Google Chrome has received multiple version updates for Windows, macOS, and Linux since last month, as well as resolving the 0-day vulnerability we just mentioned at the beginning of March. On March 2nd, Google released version 89 of Chrome with a total of 47 security fixes ranging from high severity to low severity, and includes resolution for the actively exploited 0-day, CVE 2021-21166, which is described as an object lifecycle issue in audio, according to Google. Google labeled the vulnerability as a high severity flaw and stated that, to quote them, access to bug details and links may be kept restricted until a majority of users are updated with a fix. Google went on to state that they will also retain restrictions if the bug exists in a third-party library that other projects similarly depend on but haven't yet fixed. On that note, I would also like to include the other Chromium-based browsers such as Microsoft Edge, which followed suit by releasing updates immediately after regarding the same vulnerabilities. So even though we talk about Chrome, of course, any other Chromium browser is also affected here. The same release of Edge also provided taskbar and start menu shortcut updates and fixes, improved browser performance with sleeping tabs, improved the text selection experience in PDF documents, and now kiosk mode enables additional lockdown capabilities. Mozilla Firefox and Thunderbird tend to group these together now if they ever come up, just because a lot of the updates are of course shared as well between Mozilla's Firefox and Thunderbird applications. They received multiple updates since last month. Firefox version 86 was released in February and included multiple security fixes ranging from high to low severity. Some of these fixes include issues with destination redirects, HTML sanitizer bypass, and potential spoofing in Firefox or Android. The newest version also supports simultaneously watching multiple videos in picture-in-picture mode, total cookie protection in strict mode, improved print functionality, and Firefox users in Canada can now rely on credit card management and autofill. Regarding Thunderbird, versions 78.8 and 78.8.1 were released in February as well as Monday of this week, respectively. The February release resolved the same high severity security issues as with Firefox, just mentioned, and included a number of interface enhancements. The newest version from this week also included various fixes such as open PGP errors and calendar bugs. Last but not least, I just wanted to highlight Notepad++ version 7.9.3 for Windows. I thought this was interesting. It's an interesting release because it's the first from their team that will no longer support the Windows XP or Server 2003 framework and is now strictly Windows Vista or later. Shouldn't come as a surprise to most. Hopefully none are really using that, if anyone, but he is still running those operating systems. I'd of course first recommend to migrate to a newer and supported version of Windows instead of worrying about no longer having support from Notepad++. But that again is an additional reason to not use the old versions because of course most applications are not going to support. Some additional products have also seen updates since last Patch Tuesday, including Citrix, Dropbox, LibreOffice, Malwarebytes, Opera, RingCentral, Skype, WebEx, and Zoom. And of course, lastly, my monthly reminder to all administrators, always include third-party updates and patching in general. Of course, in the patch management process, it's not just about the operating system updates. Any application can be considered a major vulnerability if not handled regularly.
That's fantastic, John. Thank you very much. And actually, just to add to that, we normally have a small area of this webcast dedicated to something that we'd like to teach you. Last month we covered off 5 of the highest vulnerabilities that affect Windows other than a patch from Microsoft. And as I mentioned right at the beginning, you know, we've been discussing and we've had a lot of feedback from clients that there's a lot of anxiety around resolving vulnerabilities, how to do it when it's not a patch, when it's a configuration. It could be a PowerShell, it could be a setting, or it could be a software update. And actually, how can our customers and how can IT managers manage those vulnerabilities in a safe way? And so Syxsense leadership actually did decide that we would publish our Syxsense secure vulnerability database to our website so that if you have these vulnerabilities in your environment, you can search for them and then you can use our advice that's published on this database to actually resolve the vulnerabilities. Now, I'm going to give you a sneak peek of it. It's going to be available from our website. It will be accessed via a resources section, and this is probably going to go live by the end of the week. And what this is going to give you is a portal into our database of all of the vulnerabilities, not only patches, but also Windows vulnerabilities as well. You have a search facility, so you can go ahead and search for anything you like, but we do have them grouped by vulnerability types, or you might call these families. So from browser extension vulnerabilities to antivirus, crypto mining, firewalls, and things like that. There's going to be an awful lot of content in here and a lot of advice that we can offer via this mechanism to help everyone really resolve their vulnerabilities, especially as we are gearing towards returning users back to the office post-COVID. So if you were to go into any of these families, as you see, we've got antivirus. We have all of the supported antivirus listed on the page, and on the left-hand side, we have all of the other families that we support. And I'll take you through some of those now. So up in the right-hand corner, if you do find any of these pages useful, please feel free to use the share to social media. You can bookmark any of these that you like. And along the left, as I mentioned, we do have the families listed. I'll just take you through a couple of these examples, and there will be an awful lot of content in here for you to review. But if we just take a look at, doesn't seem to be working. We might come back to that actually. There we go. It's probably because it's from the because I'm from the UK, so it's a little bit slow. Okay, I think we'll just here we go. Right, so as I said, you have these families along the left, and if we take a look at maybe one of these, hopefully these will actually start working based on the speed. No, I think what we'll do is we'll go straight to the next part. We might come back to that. Okay, so let's talk about Patch Tuesday for March. As you know, if you're new, there is actually more than one Patch Tuesday. There's actually 3, potentially 4 in a month. You've got 5 non-security vulnerabilities fixed in the first Tuesday of this month, where we resolved issues in Access, Office, Outlook, and Project, and that is all for Project 2016. There was, interestingly enough, a security update for Office 2010, which actually officially became obsolete, and but they're still releasing updates for them. Yesterday, we had a rather large list of vulnerabilities fixed, 89 in total, with no .NET Framework vulnerabilities fixed, which actually is in the 3rd Patch Tuesday of the month. So the 3rd Tuesday is normally reserved for .NET Framework previews. And also, we had 1 out of band, 6 0 days, and an advisory to look at as well. So the advisory is the servicing stack. So servicing stack, as we mentioned right at the front, they're not actually patches. They are critical in nature because they provide the foundation for patch installs. So you need to make sure that your device has the servicing stack installed so that patches are installed successfully. And as you saw, for different servicing stacks, different operating systems have different servicing stacks. It's very important that you make sure that those servicing stacks are installed. Now, in this Patch Tuesday, we had servicing stack updates for Windows 10 only, which covered feature updates 1809, 1909, 2004, and 2009. So other operating systems do have servicing stack updates, such as the server operating system. However, we encourage our clients to upgrade to Windows 10 2004 as soon as possible, because they actually are going to bundle the servicing stack updates in with cumulative updates. So once you get to 2004, you won't need to worry about putting the servicing stack on your machine separately, but you do need to make sure that if you don't have that feature update, that you are in fact ensuring that you have the latest one installed. So how are we going to prioritize Patch Tuesday? And we are an advocate of CVSS scoring system, but we also use the vendor severity. So we take the vendor severity which generally is from critical, medium, high, medium, low, to the CVSS score, which is a number which ranges from 10 to 0, with 10 being the worst. If you put those together, you sort of have an idea, a sort of an independent score of the severity at that point. We also have weaponization and public aware. Now, weaponization is where you have a vulnerability that is actively being exploited. And active exploited is sometimes what we call a 0-day vulnerability. Now, public aware vulnerabilities means that the code, it doesn't mean the vulnerability exists, that you have a patch for. It actually means the precise method to expose the vulnerability exists. And so from that regard, you actually have a sort of a head start that if the code exists and you let your fingers do the walking, you can find exactly how to exploit a vulnerability. So we use public aware as a way of saying, here is a head start. Let's get the vulnerabilities remediated before they become weaponized. And to counter that, to sort of balance those priorities, we have countermeasures. And countermeasures come in two forms. One of them is a mitigation, where you have something like a next generation antivirus or firewall, something that protects your environment so that you don't need to deploy the patch. And then on the other side, we've got a mitigation. So maybe you've got a registry key or a workaround that you can apply, a registry key or a service that you can stop, and that means you're not liable to the exploit. This is a way of balancing. So if there are countermeasures, some of those countermeasures are definitely easier to remediate than a large patch, and especially with some of the more Windows Server operating systems from the 2016 onwards, some of these patches can actually be very, very huge, maybe 1.8 or 1.9 gigabytes in size. With such large patches, sometimes it's easier just to mitigate via a firewall, for example, instead of rolling out a huge patch. The only thing we can't help you with unless you're a Syxsense customer is your exposure. So if your exposure is high and you have all of these other factors, you should definitely be prioritizing these. And all you need to do is from our site where we publish these, you can pop the CVE number into your toolset and actually start deploying that as soon as possible. As we mentioned, we don't actually put the content anymore into the webinar. We actually put it directly on the site, and that can actually be emailed to you as well each and every time we upload new content. So on the news page, you'll find a dedicating holding page for Patch Tuesday, but there's loads of other news on here, from Linux vulnerabilities that we talk about to zero-day vulnerabilities. We're going to look at the Patch Tuesday one here. If you already have a patching strategy, but you'd like to know if it is best practice, or if you don't have a patching strategy, you'd like to see maybe how we can help you, you can actually do the download here. Or if you have questions outside of that, you can actually talk to our techies down here. As I mentioned, this is up on the site, and if you want to, you can subscribe to this page to receive these directly in your mailbox each and every month. And all you do is you enter your details down here, click subscribe, and you get that email every time. Now, as we said, in this Patch Tuesday, we had 89 fixes. And surprisingly, we had the first Internet Explorer fix since, I think, December potentially, and it's actually given us a very, very high severity vulnerability. It's one of my priorities for today. It's actually weaponized, so it is essential that that is prioritized. But we did have updates for pretty much all of the Microsoft estate, from Windows, Azure, DevOps. We also had Edge and Exchange as well. And I think, John, you've got some updates on the Exchange vulnerability. Maybe we could cover that in a second. But if you're using Windows 7 or 2008 R2 and you do subscribe to the extended support, you do have quite a few patches to remediate this month. So this is actually the first time I've seen also that the patches don't match. So generally they release these cumulative updates that cover both the operating systems, but in fact, this is the first month for several months I've seen where we have different vulnerabilities fixed. So for Windows 7, we had 5 important vulnerabilities fixed. One of them being a print error. So when you try to print, it causes an issue. And also Windows 2008, we had 1 critical and 8 important vulnerabilities, one of them being the DNS that I'm going to mention in a second. Of course, this is the Microsoft recommendations, but we highly recommend that you include your third parties as well. So I'm going to mention 3 of the vulnerabilities that I'd like you to prioritize, and I'll go through the reasons for that. The first one is 26411. That is the Internet Explorer memory corruption vulnerability. Now, this vulnerability can be exploited if the user is mistaken to run some old school tactics, sort of click the picture or sending an email, click the link. If you can entice them to click that, then potentially your machine can be taken over. And why this is serious is that it is both weaponized and public aware. So not only is it actually exploited on devices, the actual mechanism to exploit specifically is public as well. Even though the CVSS isn't in the 9+ range, which we would call that critical, it is awfully important, especially because you have no countermeasure available. The risk alert, we call it the 6-score risk alert. This is the vectors that enable us to decide whether this is risky or not. It can be exploited over any network, both local and across the internet. Attack complexity is low, privileges are none, user interaction is required, and it is known as a jump point, or its scope is yes. Now that means that they can come in through the Internet Explorer code and jump into Windows and start going within the operating system. And those are some of the worst vulnerabilities that we need to prioritize, because if you look back to what we learned from the SolarWinds vulnerability, that is precisely what they did. They came in through one vulnerability and then they started moving sideways. And if the vulnerability exists like this, then it's something that you should be prioritizing. The second is CVE 26867. This is a Hyper-V remote code execution vulnerability. Now this one could allow an authenticated attacker. So it's slightly different. You need an authenticated attack to take place. But however, the danger is that if you can attack the guest, an attacker could exploit this into the host operating system. Again, so that means that we have the jump point. Now we do have a countermeasure. So this is only going to impact Hyper-V where it's configured to use Plan 9 file system. And this is very popular on Linux. It is a CVSS 9.9, critical in nature. And as I mentioned, it can be attacked. It does require some authentication, but if they can gain that, then that's a very, very serious vulnerability, especially as we know a lot of companies are actually running Hyper-V on their laptops, and those are the secure sandboxed environments that they're using to come back to the corporate network to try to protect their environment. But if you're running that on Linux, for example, and you're running Windows on Linux in this case, then there is actually a huge risk that they will be able to have a side lateral attack. And lastly, but not least, we're looking at 26897. This is a Windows DNS server remote code execution vulnerability. This is very serious. This is 9.8. It does have a countermeasure. So this one is if an attacker can send us a specifically crafted request and they can execute arbitrary code on the target system, which may result in complete compromise of the vulnerable system. And the countermeasure for this one is that you need to have dynamic updates enabled. So if you don't have dynamic updates enabled, I'm not sure how many of you will not have this enabled, but if you don't have this enabled, then that is a countermeasure. So it's less risky in your environment. As I mentioned, all of the vulnerabilities from Patch Tuesday has been scored with each of the factors that we use here. And I invite John, if you won't mind, have you been looking at any of these vulnerabilities that you'd like to mention today?
Yeah, quite a few I'd like to highlight, actually. A few from this list, and then I want to speak a little bit more about the Exchange out-of-band updates, especially. CVEs 2021-26412 and 26855, Microsoft Exchange Server Remote Code Execution Vulnerability for Exchange 2013, 16, and 19. The vulnerability allows a remote attacker to execute arbitrary code on the system. The vulnerability exists due to insufficient validation of user-supplied input. A remote attacker can send specially crafted data to the Exchange server and execute arbitrary code on the system. The initial attack requires the ability to make an untrusted connection to Exchange over server port 443. This can be protected against by restricting untrusted connections or setting up a VPN to separate the Exchange server from external access. Using this mitigation will only protect against the initial portion of the attack. Other portions of the chain can be triggered if an attacker already has access or can convince an administrator to open a malicious file. This has a vendor severity of critical and a industry severity of critical, CVSS score of 9.1. It has been weaponized, so you may have already heard about these particular vulnerabilities. They are quite dangerous. We'll get into that a little bit more. It is actively exploited in the wild. Public was not aware previously, and no countermeasures are offered. The 6 score risk alert, attack vectors over the network. This can be exploited by remote authenticated privileged user via the internet. Attack complexity is low, privileges are high, no user interaction required, and a jump point can be leveraged at this point. Also wanted to highlight a little bit about the other updates, what's been going on with Exchange specifically. Of course, they have released security updates for unsupported versions of Exchange as well, following these widespread attacks exploiting 4 newly discovered security vulnerabilities. They already released out-of-band emergency updates, of course, for 2013 Exchange, 16, and 19. But in light of the ongoing cyber attacks exploiting the flaws, they also rolled out updates for previously end-of-life products. This is certainly worth noting, as Microsoft obviously does not release any updates for unsupported products, except in the case of a rare event such as this. In 2017, of course, they released updates for the unsupported XPOS related to the WannaCry ransomware, and again in 2019 after identifying a severe wormable flaw. Recently, Microsoft stated that they are producing an additional series of security updates that can be applied to some older and unsupported cumulative updates. The availability of these updates does not mean that you don't have to keep your environment current. Meaning, of course, just because they released updates for old versions of Exchange, upgrade unsupported versions as soon as possible to maintain full support going forward. They did go on to state that this is intended only as a temporary measure to help protect vulnerable machines right now. Still need to update to the latest supported cumulative update and apply the applicable security updates. If you already met update to a later cumulative update, you should continue with that update. Also, as mentioned briefly earlier, the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, issued another warning yesterday for organizations to apply Microsoft's updates, stating CISA urges all organizations across all sectors, highlight of all over all, to follow guidance to address the widespread domestic and international exploitation of Microsoft Exchange Server product vulnerabilities. An adversary can exploit this vulnerability, or rather in this case, of course, multiple vulnerabilities, to compromise your network and steal information, encrypt data for ransom, or even execute a destructive attack. So, of course, if it isn't clear already, if this does apply to you, make sure that you deploy it as soon as possible. And if you're running old versions, even though they are temporarily supported of Exchange, do make sure that you figure out a plan to upgrade that particular role as soon as possible.
That's brilliant, John. I did see though that Microsoft has said that the Office 365 as web platform doesn't actually have a vulnerability. It is just premise-based. Is that still the case?
Yeah, in my findings, it was premise-based installations.
Yeah, and I think probably before COVID, probably premise servers were still very, very popular, and I imagine they probably are still very, very popular. So yeah, that's brilliant advice. Thank you, John. Okay, issues, some very serious ones we need to mention that we've actually been learning from some of our clients, but also some feedback from some of our webinar emails that we sent before. These ones, however, it's the same. Microsoft has said that certain operations may fail on clustered shared volumes with the Windows 7 and 2008 R2 vulnerabilities. Microsoft are recommending that you take extra precautions during your testing. And this one, this is actually something that is brand new. We've only seen announcements on this. It's KB 5000802, is causing blue screen of death. Blue screen, black screen, if you're using this Kyocera printer. Now, I've also found a few articles where other printers are affected. There is no fix from those companies yet on a new driver. However, we do recommend that you postpone the deployment of that patch until you've done your testing or until new drivers are provided by those printer companies. We also have the user certificates getting lost when you update. That's typically if you don't install the most appropriate SSU updates prior to installing those updates. So it's very, very important because once you lose your certificates, you can't get them back unless you restore the operating system. And then lastly, this one's here quite a lot. This is the Microsoft Japanese input method editor. Sometimes the characters don't display properly. Microsoft is still working on a solution. Now, if you are using Windows 10 Home and Pro, John, we have some feedback on the future life of those feature updates that you're using.
Yeah, absolutely. There aren't any changes from the previous month, but there's something to look forward to very shortly this year. In May, especially as we see on the screen, the consumer versions, Home and Pro of Windows 10, if you're running 1909, it will be coming to an end. Because I believe, yes, okay, so it's on the next slide. So yes, if you are on 1909 again, it will be coming to an end very shortly, so do make sure you figure out a plan. And as recommended at this point, 2004 or later would be a great option to go with. Although, from what you see on this slide, even if you go to 2004, you've only got an additional 6 or 7 months or so until you'll have to upgrade again. So 20H2 is also available, of course. That is the latest revision, and so far I've heard pretty good reviews about it. So would recommend, even if you have the ability, go to the latest. It'll give you the longest support. And then the next slide, Rob. Yeah, and then for business versions, business editions, enterprise and education, of course, typically you're going to get a longer life cycle on these. The last year and a half has been quite interesting with Microsoft extending a number of these versions. As you see on the bottom of the list, we kind of have a bit of a gap in terms of support. A later version, as we see here, 1903 is already marked as unsupported, but older versions are still supported until May as well. 1803, 1809 for enterprise were extended during the beginning of the pandemic to make it easier for administrators to deploy their versions, but they will also be coming to an end in May. And 2004 actually for business editions, sorry, Rob, is that correct? Until 2021 might be the year after for version 2004. I'll double check on that. 2004 is of course a spring release, so it doesn't get the same life cycle. So yes, that will also be coming to an end at the end of the year, but you can actually go with the version before if you have enterprise. Again, very different from Pro, Home or Pro versions. The 1909 version for enterprise will still have continued support well into 2022.
Yeah. Yeah, this is due to the COVID and Microsoft being worried about the enormous deployments that would take place if users from home were forced into deploying such huge updates. Of course, as we mentioned before, feature updates are not patches; they are actually Windows upgrades. So it's taking you to pretty much a brand new version of Windows. So there's certainly a lot more planning and strategy that you need if you are going to do a deployment, because it could take up to an hour and a half just to apply it. So thanks to Microsoft, they extended some of these, but some of these versions, if you're on these, you really don't have a lot of time. And I think I read somewhere that, is it 18 months general? You got a general life cycle every 18 months. You'll be going through the Windows feature update upgrades. I think that's what I've heard.
Yeah, 18 months for enterprise, and what we've seen in the past few years is that Microsoft is changing the life cycle for, between fall and spring releases. The spring release will have a shorter life cycle, and the fall will have a longer life cycle. So you'll get the extra amount of time on a fall release. Spring release will pretty much have a very similar end date with Pro.
Yeah. And for everyone watching, this is actually all American date format. I actually mixed them up a couple of sessions ago because I read them wrong. So these are all American formats, but they're all available from this location. So if you pop that URL into your browser, you can actually get the very latest details. And we just have one I've just marked orange, which is your 2016 LTSB, which comes to mainstream support later on this year. Okay, so let's go back to our website. We actually have all of the Linux vulnerabilities up on our site as well. We actually do release vulnerabilities for Linux every single week. So typically on a Monday, at the very latest on a Tuesday. The reason is for the Microsoft Patch Tuesday, they typically release them on the first, second, and third Tuesday. It's generally fixed unless it's known as an out-of-band update. But for Linux, the cadence is much, much faster. So they may actually fix a kernel update this week for Red Hat, and then next week, they might actually update it again. So we do actually like to keep on top of Linux where we can. But what we've done is we've taken our top vulnerabilities of the entire month, so the whole month of February, we popped it on our site. And I think, John, you'd like just to go through some of these ones for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to point out before going through the list that I've ordered these in terms of the industry severity based on the CVSS score? One thing that's quite common, which we discussed when looking at Linux, of course, the different manufacturers and distributions, is that there's going to be a bit of kind of mixed ratings here. The first I'd like to highlight is a buffer overflow impacting Python 27, 36, and 38. The vendor in this case has provided a severity of medium, although this is the first one on my list, so it has the highest severity, CVSS score of 9.8. Stack-based buffer overflow was discovered in the ctypes module provided within Python. Applications that use this without carefully validating the input past it may be vulnerable to this flaw, which would allow an attacker to overflow a buffer on the stack and crash the application. This 6-score risk alert, this vulnerability has a critical risk as this can be exposed over any network with low complexity, no privileges, and without user interaction. The next update, Xterm vulnerability within Ubuntu 20.1, 20.04, 18.04, 16.04, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8. Vendor severity in this case, medium/important, although second on my list, still has a very high score, 9.8 CVSS. In this case, Xterm incorrectly handles certain character sequences. A remote attacker could use this issue to cause Xterm to crash, resulting in a denial of service or possibly execute arbitrary code. The 6-score risk alert, this vulnerability has a critical risk as this can be exposed over any network with low complexity, again, no privileges, and without user interaction. Next update would be a screen update for SUSE Enterprise Server 12 Service Pack 2 to 12 Service Pack 5. In this case, they have provided a vendor severity of important, although the CVSS score is 9.8. I'd like to point out that might actually be under review. But still at the moment does have quite an extremely high CVSS score. Fixed double width combining character handling UTF-8 character that could lead to a denial of service or code execution. Our 6-score risk alert, this vulnerability again has a critical risk as it can be again exposed over any network with again low complexity, no privileges, and without user interaction. The next update is for Mozilla Thunderbird. Now, of course, when I go over third-party updates, many of those could apply towards Linux as well, but just to specify this one directly, the vendor, in this case, Mozilla, provided a severity of important, although it has a CVSS score of 8.8. So just below the critical mark, but it still has a high severity as mentioned previously when going through the Thunderbird changes. memory safety bugs present in Firefox 85 and Firefox extended release 78.7. Some of these bugs showed evidence of memory corruption, and we presume that with enough effort, some of these could have been exploited to run arbitrary code. And since Firefox and Thunderbird are pretty much the same framework, of course, it would affect either. Syxscore risk alert. This has a high risk, but it can still be exposed over any network with low complexity, no privileges, but does require user interaction in this case. The last update to highlight, kernel update for Oracle Linux 6 and 7. In this case, Oracle's provided a vendor severity of important. CVSS score is lower in this case, 7.8, but any CVSS score, of course, should be concerning. Zen is vulnerable to a denial of service caused by error handling and mapping. Local attacker could exploit this vulnerability to crash the corresponding backend driver, potentially affecting the entire domain running that backend driver. Our risk alert, this does have a moderate risk as it can be exposed over a local network with low complexity, no privileges, and again, without user interaction.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you. I think we just have a little update for macOS as well.
Yeah, some information for Mac. This week, Apple pushed out security updates for a memory corruption bug to devices running on iOS, macOS, watchOS, and for Safari. If exploited, this high severity vulnerability could allow remote attackers to completely compromise affected systems. This vulnerability has a CVSS score of 7.7 out of 10, of course, but don't let that lower your priority. Update any macOS devices as soon as possible to ensure that they are secure. There was also a Safari version release. Again, Apple has released a new version for macOS, Catalina, and Mojave users.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you. All right. I think what we'll do is we'll head back to Heidi to see if we have any questions that we can answer. And I might see if I can bring up the solution database if it is going to work for me. Whilst Heidi, you'd like to ask any questions so far?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a few, and there's still time if anybody wants to use the chat feature to ask them while we're answering these other ones. Feel free. And if we don't get to your question, we will reply in an email as well. So feel free to ask. The first one is, if the operating system is up to date, but my Office version is no longer supported, why do I need to patch it?
Right. Okay. So obsolete software actually poses two risks. The first one is that with the code being no longer supported by the vendor, it means that you have a potential huge amount of time that hackers can actually start trying to expose the code in that version, knowing that you're not going to be patching it any further. That being said, we have seen Microsoft provide fixes for software known as out of band for Office 2010, even though it was officially not supported. But that doesn't mean they're always going to do it. It really is based on the risk that Microsoft see at the time, whether or not they're actually going to release a fix for an obsolete version. But it's very, very important that you do so. Just because that version is out of date doesn't mean that hackers aren't trying to weaponize threats with that version.
As I always mention as well, it's not just about the operating system. Make sure you push out any application updates as well. They can be, in some cases, even more critical than what the OS may have flaws with.
Great, guys. Next question is, which unsupported Exchange versions also received updates?
Realize I may not have actually said that version. Exchange Server 2010. So I won't go for any older versions from that, but they did, again, as mentioned earlier, provide updates for an unsupported version, and that is for 2010.
Thank you. Also, is Flash going to be in 21H1?
Yeah, no, it's not. Ironically, although Flash became end of life at the beginning of the year, 20H2 was the feature update released at the end of last year, which actually did include Flash within it. So if you have uninstalled Flash already, but you are planning to upgrade feature update to last year's feature update, you will actually need to uninstall Flash again, I'm afraid. So, but it won't be in 21H1. It's confirmed by Microsoft. It will not be in that version.
Okay, thank you. And then this is the last question we have, unless anybody wants to add more to the chat. Next one is, what makes a patch a 0-day?
Okay, so 0-day is actually, the word 0-day is really where you've got a vulnerability where you have no time or you have very little time to start resolving it. And it's really based on those statuses. So if you have something that is currently weaponized, that's where you may find it being called a 0-day. Sometimes it's 0-day and sometimes it's the numbers, the letters number 0 and then 0-day, but both of them mean exactly the same thing. It means the vulnerability is being exploited and you may have a patch or you may not have a patch. So where you have a 0-day vulnerability where the patch does not exist, you will need something like what I'm looking at on the screen here is an alternative. So you're applying a setting, changing something, uninstalling software, or you have mitigations such as a next generation antivirus that would actually mean that you're not susceptible to it. Those are the really very dangerous vulnerabilities that are 0-day where a patch doesn't actually exist.
That's great. That's all the questions from the audience.
That's fantastic. Well, we really appreciate your time with us today. As I mentioned, this is going to be recorded and it will be published for everybody. If you would love to subscribe, you'll get this in an email, plus also a copy of the recording as well via email. We hope that some of the patches we've highlighted this week will help you prioritize your Patch Tuesday strategy. And of course, for the until the next time, we wish you happy patching.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes, bye.